Scale Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Spencer Nadolsky, and today we have one of our awesome RDs on the podcast, Rita Setrakin, and she is really into fitness along with the nutrition, and we're actually going to be talking about emotional eating today. So welcome, Rita.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get into it.
Very good. So you got into nutrition when?
Probably when I was 18, I played a lot of sports and then I kind of went to college. And, when you stop playing sports, you're not burning as many calories and your whole routine is off. So you go to college and you gain the freshman 15. And that's kind of where I started. I was like, I need to learn how to get into fitness for myself. And then that's kind of how I got into nutrition. So it's been a journey, but it's been awesome.
So it started with yourself, and then you were like, I kind of like this. I'm going to help others. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I always knew that I wanted to do something like speaking to other people and helping, and I didn't really know the path. But I guess when I got into nutrition for myself, I was like, okay, I can do this and I can help other people as well. And food is something I've always been super passionate about. I love cooking, so this is the path.
That's great. So how'd you start getting into the kind of this emotional eating stuff? Like, well, how did you make that kind of like one of your areas of expertise?
Yeah, I think there's just so much information out there about different diets and such, and so when you start getting into it, you can't help but fall into emotional eating, right? Because it's like, okay, I'm restricting this, I'm restricting that, and then there's so much emotion around it. There's so much stress when you're in school, and I kind of learned like I need to have some coping mechanisms outside of that, and that's where I got passionate about it. And in starting to see different clients and speaking to people, it's just something that's so prevalent and something that I want to help people kind of get through.
Yeah, what are some common scenarios where you see like emotional eating?
I think the most common one is a long, stressful day after work, right? And it's just tied to so many different emotions, right? It can be stress, loneliness, anxiety. You come home and maybe you didn't even have time to eat all day when you were at work, and food is a coping mechanism, right? You're alone and there's nothing else to do, and it feels good to eat. So, something we turn to very easily.
So is this something you solved in yourself and then you started solving it for clients of yours?
Yeah, I'd kind of go all day, busy with classes and sometimes skipping meals, not knowing what to eat. And then it would be nighttime and, there's cereal, there's trail mix, whatever is
Mm.
kind of in your dorm, and you kind of binge eat on that, right? And I learned if I could balance out my day and have all these different coping mechanisms, which we can get into, I'm less likely to kind of engage in emotional eating. So that's kind of where it started. And then, listening to other people, what are their triggers, and kind of working with them to kind of undo some of that has been what I've been into.
So would you define emotional eating as like eating without necessarily being hungry per se, but having uh, eating because it makes you feel better
Mhm.
and alleviating your emotions, short temporarily alleviating some of those emotions you might have.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, you can be hungry, right? But you're consuming food to cope with the emotion rather than because you're actually satisfying your hunger
Yeah,
or to provide energy. And sometimes it feels more like you have no control over that in that setting.
yeah.
So that's how you can kind of differentiate it.
Okay. So, what are some of the coping mechanisms that you've used with yourself and maybe with clients?
So I think the most important thing is preparation, right? So I can sit here and tell you, okay, like when you run into this situation of emotional eating, do this and that, but when you're in that stressful mindset, it's really hard to kind of take a step back. So I think being more prepared throughout the day is kind of the key to avoiding that behavior more often. So the first one is not to skip meals because you're kind of like starving your body of nutrients, right? And eventually it's going to ask for them. So if you haven't eaten all day and you're super busy, once you settle down, your body's gonna be like, "Okay, I need food," right? And you're not gonna look for a salad.
No, I
You're
don't.
yeah, so you're probably gonna want something that's quick energy, right? So carbs, higher fat, maybe because your body like really needs more energy and it's more nutrient dense. So I'd say not skipping meals is probably step one.
Okay, so not skipping meals. Let's say you don't skip meals. You're like, no, I eat
Mhm.
regularly, and I get home and I just grab the potato chips or whatever, just because I'm
Right.
stressed. So then
Mhm.
what's your next step after?
Okay. So even before you get there, right? It's like what did your meals consist of? So were
Mm-hmm.
you cutting carbs all day? Did you have these balanced meals, right? So I kind of look at diets kind of similarly, right? Whether it's a low carb or low fat, you're essentially cutting out this whole food group, right? And then you eat less, right? But you need all these different foods for different roles in your body. So when you can have more of balance, right, you can kind of level off your blood sugar levels a little bit. You don't have these crashes, and then you're craving like the potato chips or the candy at the end of the day. So I think balance is like the next step. So I didn't skip my meals. I had balance so that my cravings aren't that crazy by the end of the day. And balance can look a little bit different for each person, but are you having a source of protein on your plate? Do you have a starchy carbohydrate? So that could be rice, pasta, bread, but also corn, squash. Do you have fruits and vegetables? Do you have a healthy fat? And when you can kind of create that consistency, I think it mitigates those crazy cravings at the end of the day. So
Okay.
balance.
Okay. So balance, regular meal structure.
hmm
Then what?
Okay, so I think the next one would be mindfulness when you're eating.
Okay.
So sometimes we just eat, right? And kind of look at yourself and be like, am I sitting in front of the TV? Am I scrolling aimlessly through Instagram the entire day? Or am I actually enjoying the food that I'm consuming, right? So, what I like to do is kind of use my five senses. Like, what does the food taste like? What does it smell like? What is the texture? And that way I can really appreciate what I'm eating rather than just sitting there and eating mindlessly. Um, Right. So, because when you get into emotional eating, you've already built this habit of enjoying the food you're eating. Because sometimes I have people who say, for example, like they grabbed a box of cookies and they didn't even notice that they finished the entire box and they go to reach for another one and it's already done. And they're like, wait, I didn't even realize that I ate all of that, right? So when you
Mm-hmm.
practice that mindfulness outside of those moments, I think you can like better carry into the moment of emotional eating so you can actually enjoy the food.
Yes. Very good. Okay. So now that you're working with people on these new powerful
Mhm.
medicines that kind of tamper down some of those feelings regardless, what are you seeing? Are you still having to help with emotional eating type of stuff?
Actually, no, I think with being on these medications, it's really declined in people because they feel like that food noise is kind of shut off. So, you're having more ability to focus on those other habits, like not skipping your meals, having more balance, not just always giving into craving. So, we do have an emotional eating support group, but honestly, I feel like most of the people that I see um, that habit and that behavior is really reduced.
Okay. That's great. So what do you do? What do you do when, if they still have emotional eating? Do you just do
hmm
these kind of habits with them if they're still having it
Yeah.
despite the medicine?
Yeah, I think we always work to like the not skipping meals, the balanced meals, but then also working on like stress reduction. So, what are your other coping mechanisms when you are stressed, right? And it should be unrelated to food. So, what do you do with your time outside of work, right? Are you pouring into yourself or are you kind of living like aimlessly? And I'm not an expert on stress reduction, but I can just speak from what I do, right? Having some sort of hobby. So, I play the piano when I come home. I de-stress that way. I will journal, engage in like physical activity. Can you go for a walk? Do you have a support system? So practicing all these different things, I think kind of reduces stress. So even if you do run into emotional eating because stress is a big factor, you have other coping mechanisms as well.
Very cool. Do you What about like exercise and doing things, yeah, that are like things that, you know, not eating,
Yeah.
nutrition related?
Yeah, I mean, I think exercise for some people can be stress inducing. So not everybody loves exercise the way I
Hmm.
do. So, but finding something that you like. So it doesn't have to be that, you go to the gym and you lift weights. It could be a yoga class, it could be a dance class, you could go for a walk. So kind of, identifying what that looks like for you and finding something that's sustainable and enjoyable rather than forcing yourself to do something that you really despise because it's not going to stick.
Yeah. What are you seeing? We've had a few of the dietitians on this podcast. What are the biggest things you're seeing with when you're trying to help clients or patients that are taking these medicines?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the opposite, right? So we see less of um, eating a lot, and we see people kind of afraid to eat because I think that's a the big factor as well. It's like fear of eating to gain weight, right? And I think it's a misconception to think that being on medication means that you should have no appetite, right? You want to have an appetite to where you could eat these balanced meals and not skip meals and build these habits while fueling your body properly. And especially when you start getting into exercise and such, you don't want to be overdoing it and then also not having enough energy and nutrients. So it's kind of the opposite. We're working towards, making sure that people are eating enough sometimes.
Yeah. What? How do you get them to do that? Like, how do you get them not afraid?
It's a lot of like, again, that emotional work. As an RD, it's not really telling people you should eat this or you shouldn't eat that. It's more like, okay, what are your fears around food? What are your emotions around food? Kind of undoing a lot of that diet culture, especially with things like carbs, right? People are so afraid to eat carbs because they think, I eat a carb and I gain weight the next day, and that's not
Yeah,
really the
it's
case.
not true. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
kind of a little bit of education, but also just being really empathetic and listening to how people feel around food and undoing some of that. And people can kind of identify that for themselves. It just takes some time to talk to somebody else who maybe has like a different perspective or asks you the right questions to get you to undo that. And that's kind of what I do. I don't really sit there and give anybody a meal plan. It's more like focusing on what you can add to your plate. I think that's the biggest takeaway when somebody has a session with me is what can you add to your plate as opposed to what you can take out. And it kind of helps you let go of that like um restrictive mindset and the negative mindset towards food.
Yeah. Is it carbs is probably the biggest one you're seeing, I bet.
Yeah.
That's always the biggest one. They all think they have to do keto. Nobody has to do keto to lose weight unless that's really what makes them stick to a lower calorie diet. Um,
Yeah.
what about are you? I always ask everybody that comes on here that's an RD. What about protein? Are you seeing it's really hard to get enough protein in these individuals?
I think sometimes people think that they need a lot more protein than they do. So it becomes like kind of an obsession and you start skipping out on the other parts of your plate. So a lot of people will say, I ate all the protein, but I didn't have any of the vegetables or the carbs on my plate. So most people are getting more than they need. Obviously, if you're exercising and you have a different lifestyle, you might need some more. But for those who have a hard time, protein shakes are always helpful, whether that's like a plant-based or a whey-based. So it kind of depends on the person. But yeah, I think protein is of concern. If you don't have enough, kind of causes hair loss too. So yeah, I think, most people are getting enough though.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And what about like getting enough vegetables? Because if you're so full, the vegetables can sometimes be tough. And GI
Yeah.
issues from it, maybe.
Yeah. So with the vegetables, I think trying to reduce volume. So for somebody who doesn't have a huge appetite and feels like they're full really fast, you're not gonna want to have a huge salad, right? Instead, you'd focus on more dense nutrients, like maybe broccoli or green beans, asparagus, things like that, as opposed to having a really large salad. Um, but that's where I would start.
Very good. And fruits?
Oh, that's a big one. There's a lot of emotions around fruits and being
Yeah.
afraid of sugar.
Yeah, I can
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah,
Do
yeah.
you,
With fruits, yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to say, and yeah, go ahead. You talk about the fruits. I'd like to hear.
Yeah, I think with fruits, it's like there's so many nutrients and there's so much value in fruits, but I say to kind of try and pair it with something. So whether you pair that with like a protein or like nuts or something, if people are really afraid of like, well, it's going to cause a spike in my blood sugar levels, well, pair it with something that has more fiber, more fat to slow down digestion. But also if you're on a GLP-1, it's going to kind of do that for you anyway. So it can kind of help take away some of that fear.
Yeah. And have you noticed that anybody's mad that they can't, or that they don't want to eat dessert type of stuff? Or I always ask patients this too. they tend to say that no, I still enjoy those foods, but like I just don't need to have them anymore. Are you seeing any of
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I see that a lot, and I think it really depends on the person. But some people are fearful, right? And that's like the other side of emotional eating is like avoiding certain things. And again, that's an emotion, but then it gets into like avoidant and restrictive behavior. So sometimes people will completely avoid dessert just because they feel like they don't have control. And then those who are really, utilizing this medication as a tool to kind of learn to have more balance, they can have that dessert and let go of that restrictive mindset and, like have a few bites or whatever it is to satisfy their cravings. And then they don't have to have the whole rest of the cake.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. Anything else? So we have a bunch of listeners who are part of Sequence, but there are people
Mhm.
that are listening that are like, I'm on the fence.
Yeah.
Anything, maybe they're on GLP-1 medicines. They just want to learn. Anything else, any other little tidbits you've learned while working with us at Sequence?
Yeah, I've learned that, I think working with a dietitian is super helpful because they can kind of give you those tools of like that we talked about, like what does a balanced plate look like? How do I not skip meals? How do I eat when I'm not hungry, right? How do I create more nutrient dense meals without all this volume? So, and it's really specific to the individual. So that's what I've kind of learned that giving out a meal plan or anything like that is not really helpful. And in talking to somebody, you can kind of take what you're already eating and just build on it. So if you're somebody who loves cereal for breakfast, like how do you make that more balanced instead of saying I can't have cereal anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
You love tacos for lunch. How do you improve on that? And I think you can do that by speaking to somebody rather than just relying on your own your own knowledge or your own will, right? So that's like been a really big thing that I've learned in this program. Um, and also that it's unrealistic that you're never going to have cravings. I think people sometimes panic, right? That, well, what if the craving comes back, right? It might, and that's the point of kind of building these habits is that when that does happen, you already know that you have the tools to kind of get through it. And another thing that I've noticed with members is kind of letting go of being so critical of yourself when you kind of fall off like what you think is on plan for you, right? So it's unrealistic to think that like you're never going to fall off plan. It's unrealistic to think that you're never going to have dessert ever again or overeat ever again. So what makes a diet sustainable and more powerful is moving on from whatever you think was a mistake. So,
Yeah, that's good. Yeah,
yeah.
Gary, the chief scientific officer for
Hmm.
Weight Watchers, was on a couple episodes ago and talked about talking to yourself like a friend.
Yeah.
And Shelby, the other another dietitian, was on talking about, hey, making sure you set realistic goals. So I think it sounds like everybody's pretty aligned.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
That's
as a
good.
team, we're definitely all aligned on that same philosophy. And we do also have that emotional eating support group where it's helpful because maybe you're not engaging in like overeating, but while you are on the medication, it's a good place to start and learn like, okay, I have a little bit more control now. So if I am thrown into the fire at some point, right, I've already built these habits. So I think that's a really big benefit on being on this medication is like giving your mind the space to kind of, work through some of the stuff that you were facing before medication.
That's great. Well, thanks for coming on. It was great chatting with you. And if anybody is listening, you know somebody that struggles with emotional eating and is wondering about these medicines, give this episode a share to them, friends and family, and whoever else. So thanks, Rita. We'll have to have you on again.
Thank you for